Let's begin by grounding ourselves in what this unit actually is, because before we study freedom, we need to understand how we are studying freedom. Freedom in this course is not a condition. It's not something that simply appears once laws change. It is something that is practiced. It's constructed, negotiated, and defended in real time. And what distinguishes Unit 3 is that it does not present African Americans as passive recipients of change. It shows them as active agents, people who are building lives, institutions, identities, and futures within systems that are often working to restrict them. So as we move through this unit, we're not asking what freedoms were given. We're asking, how was freedom practiced? In the aftermath of the Civil War, the question of freedom first takes shape in the domain of law, with the federal government attempts to redefine the meaning of citizenship itself. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, the 14th establishes birthright citizenship and equal protection, and the 15th Amendment extends voting rights to black men. This is not just a set of legal changes, it's a political restructuring of the nation. In the engraved portraits of black legislators serving in Reconstruction governments, we're not simply looking at individuals. We're witnessing the emergence of black political participation at a national level. The presence of these legislators represent a short-term political expansion of freedom, but it also signals a long-term transformation in terms of who can exercise power within American democracy. What we're seeing here is not the arrival of freedom, it's the opening of possibility. And that possibility is immediately contested. As Reconstruction unfolds, new systems emerge to contain and redirect that freedom. Black codes are enacted across the South, restricting movement, labor, and autonomy. A labor contract in this context is not just an agreement, it's an economic mechanism designed to reproduce dependency. Vagrancy laws are not just about employment, they're tools of social control. When we examine documents like land orders or Freedmen's Bureau circulars, we see attempts to regulate labor and mobility. And when we look at images of convict labor camps, we're witnessing the emergence of a system in which incarceration becomes tied to a forced labor, an economic and political continuation of exploitation under a new legal framework. Freedom is still being practiced, but it's being practiced within systems that are actively working to contain it. By the end of Reconstruction, that containment becomes more formalized. States begin rewriting laws to enforce segregation. Voting rights are systematically suppressed, and in 1896, the Supreme Court ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson establishes the doctrine of separate but equal. This is not just a legal decision, it's a political and social reordering of American life. A segregated water fountain is not just a public facility, it's a visible expression of hierarchy. A railroad car becomes a site where inequality is enforced in everyday life. And the violence that accompanies this system, lynchings, mob attacks, and later the destruction of communities like Greenwood and Tulsa serve as a social mechanism of enforcement. These are not isolated acts. They are part of a system that reinforces a strict code of racial order. And yet, even within these constraints, African Americans are actively constructing freedom in ways that are deeply social and communal. In the years following emancipation, families began reworking unity. Advertisements placed in newspapers by individuals searching for long relatives are not simply personal notices, they are acts of social reconstruction. They reflect the long-term impact of slavery on family structures, but also the determination to rebuild them. The Freedmen's Bureau plays a role in this process, not only by distributing aid, but by legalizing marriages and establishing schools. These actions carry both social and political significance, helping to formalize relationships that had previously been denied recognition. Family in this moment becomes a site where freedom is restored and redefined. At the same time, education emerges as one of the most powerful tools for shaping that freedom. Historically, black colleges and universities are established in response to exclusion from existing institutions. These are not simply educational spaces, they are intellectual centers where ideas about progress, leadership, and identity are debated. At places like Tuskegee Institute, where figures like George Washington Carver are working with students, we see the economic and intellectual dimensions of education. Knowledge is tied to self-sufficiency and innovation. The debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois reflects competing visions of advancement. Washington emphasizes industrial training and economic stability at Tuskegee University, and Du Bois argues for higher education and political engagement as he teaches at Clark Atlanta University. This is not just disagreement. It's an intellectual struggle over the future of black life in America. And when we read the work of Anna Julia Cooper or Nannie Helen Burroughs, we see that black women are shaping the intellectual landscape as well, emphasizing education as a means of both racial and gender uplift. Economic life develops alongside these intellectual and institutional efforts, and African Americans begin building businesses and banks and networks that support community stability, and the rise of the black press provides a platform for communication, advocacy, resistance, and racial uplift. An advertisement for Madam C.J. Walker's products is not simply commercial, it represents economic independence and entrepreneurship. Her company creates opportunities for black women to participate in business at a national scale. Photographs of Walker's agents gathered at Villa Lawaro are not just images of success. They reflect the formation of professional networks and collective advancement. Similarly, institutions like Black-owned banks provide financial infrastructures that allow communities to begin to sustain wealth even within a segregated economy. These developments demonstrate that economic life is not separate from political life, social life. It's not separate from freedom. It's one of the ways that freedom is made durable. And at the same time, African Americans are not only building institutions, they're developing frameworks for understanding their experience. In We Wear the Mask, a poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, he captures the emotional and psychological dimensions of living in a society structured by inequality. The mask becomes a way of navigating that reality, a social and psychological strategy. In The Souls of Black Folks by W.E.B. Du Bois, he introduces the concept of double consciousness. It's not an abstraction, it's an intellectual response to lived conditions. It reflects both constraint and possibility. Double consciousness reveals the tension of being both inside and outside American society, the two-ness, one American and one Negro, but it also provides a way of analyzing that condition. This is an intellectual tool, one that allows African Americans to interpret and respond to the structures around them. And that intellectual work expands into what becomes known as the New Negro Movement. Here, identity itself becomes a site of transformation. Writers, artists, athletes, and others begin to reject imposed definitions and create new representations of Black life. This is not simply artistic expression, it's a cultural, political, and cultural intervention. People like Jack Johnson, the first Black heavyweight champion, and texts like Elaine Locke's The New Negro articulate a vision of racial pride and self-definition. Langston Hughes challenges the expectation that Black artists conform to white standards, insisting instead on authenticity and cultural rootedness. This movement reflects both intellectual and cultural transformation, reshaping how African Americans see themselves and how they're seen by others. That shift becomes even more visible in visual media. The photographs of James Vanderzee document everyday life in Harlem, families, workers, celebrations, and community spaces. These images are not neutral. They are constructive representations that emphasize dignity, stability, and beauty. And in doing so, they challenge dominant narratives that portray African Americans in limiting or degrading ways. This is a form of cultural resistance, one that operates through representation. Freedom is being practiced here in how life is documented and defined. Movement, too, becomes a strategy for reshaping possibility, for the Great Migration represents one of the largest internal movements of people here in the United States of America. African Americans begin to leave the South at around 1919 in search of economic opportunity, safety, and autonomy. And not just places like the North and the Midwest, but also to the West Coast. It's a collective response to these structural conditions, and Jacob Lawrence's Migration series paintings captures the movement not as a single event, but as a process shaped by decision-making, urgency, and hope. The Great Migration has both economic and social consequences, reshaping cities, labor markets, and cultural and political life across the country. This movement extends beyond national boundaries, while Afro-Caribbean migrants arrive in the United States, bringing new cultural, linguistic, and religious traditions. Their presence expands the diversity of Black communities and introduces new perspectives. This is not simply immigration, it's diasporic interaction. And the work of Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, that interaction becomes global in scope. You see, Garvey's vision of a unified Black diaspora reflects a political and ideological shift. The UNIA operates across continents, connecting people through shared identity, struggle, and possibility. Now, this is where it's important to be precise because there's a common misunderstanding. Garvey is often reduced to the idea of a mass, quote, back to Africa movement, as if he was simply calling for all African Americans and other Blacks to leave the United States and other parts of the world to return to Africa. That's not quite accurate. What Garvey meant by back to Africa was not a physical relocation. It was a psychological, political, economic, self-determining idea. It was about redefining Africa not as a place of origin to be escaped, but as a source of identity, pride, and global connection. It was about building Black-controlled institutions, fostering economic interdependence, and imagining a future in which people of African descent could operate on their own terms, whether it be in the United States, the Caribbean, Africa itself, or anywhere on the globe. The Black Star Line, while limited in its long-term success, represents an attempt to make that vision tangible, an economic and symbolic effort to connect the diaspora and assert autonomy. And here's why this matters for the exam. You see, you can recognize and address that misconception, but if you can't explain that Garvey's vision was all about global Black unity and self-determination, you're not demonstrating nuance. You see, the kind of thinking that earns a complexity point is that very nuance. Now let's talk about how we can use this kind of thinking for the AP exam and what it's going to require of you. What I want you to do as you listen to these examples is not just to hear the answer, but to pay attention to the moves being made, because that's what you're practicing. So let's take an example look at an FRQ, free response question. Explain how African Americans practiced freedom in the period from Reconstruction to the early 20th century. If you see a question like this, your first move is to organize before you write. Do not start listing everything. Remember instead, pause, decide, what structure am I going to use? For this question, one of the strongest approaches is to organize by domain. So as you plan your response, think legal, institutional, cultural. Use a framework and then build your answer across those categories. For example, you might write, in the legal domain, African Americans practiced freedom through political participation during Reconstruction, including voting and holding office. In the institutional domain, they built schools, churches, and businesses that supported community stability and interdependence. And in the cultural domain, they expressed freedom through literature, music, and art that redefined Black identity and challenged dominant narratives. Notice what's happening here. You're not saying everything. You're showing organized analytical thinking, and that's what earns points. Here's a second example. Explain how African Americans responded to racial violence during the Red Summer of 1919. Now, your first move here is different. The question is asking you to deal with both constraint and response. So before you write, ask yourself, what is the situation and how did people respond to it? Then structure your answer around that relationship. For example, you might say, during the Red Summer of 1919, African Americans faced widespread racial violence driven by economic competition, tensions involving returning Black veterans, and white supremacist hostility. In response, African Americans resisted both physically and intellectually, defending their communities while also producing cultural works that call for dignity and resistance. Claude McKay's If We Die serves as a powerful example of this response, encouraging collective resistance and affirming the humanity of Black people in the face of violence. Now notice the structure: context, response, example, meaning. That's a complete answer. And more importantly, it shows that even in moments of intense constraint, African Americans are still practicing freedom. So as you prepare, remember this: every FRQ is not just asking you what happened, it's asking how you organize, interpret, and explain what happened. And if you can control that structure, you can control the answer. So another exam strategy allows you to step back and look at what we just did with those FRQs. There's a pattern. We just didn't recall information, we organized it, interpreted it, and connected it to something larger. That exact same process is what you need to bring every source you see on the exam, because when you encounter a source, your first instinct might be to describe what you're looking at. But description by itself doesn't earn points. Interpretation does. So here's how you take the same moves you just saw in those FRQ examples and apply them to any source in Unit 3. First, identify the form of freedom being practiced. Ask yourself, what is the person or community or institution or organization doing? Are they building something, creating something, moving, organizing? Secondly, identify the constraint. What system is shaping or limiting this movement? Segregation, violence, economic restriction, racism, social exclusion. Third, connect it to a larger idea. What does this reveal about African Americans and how they're navigating and reshaping their world? Now let's make that concrete. If you see a photograph of a Black school, don't just say this is a school. That's description. Instead, build it the same way you built the FRQ. This source shows African Americans practicing freedom through education by creating Black institutions that supported advancement despite segregation, reflecting broader efforts to build independent systems within a constrained society. That's interpretation, that's the move, and that's what earns the points. So how do you study for this particular part of the exam? The skill that the exam is measuring has to prepare yourself to match it. So you don't prepare interpretation by passively reviewing information, you practice that information. Think of your studying not as memorizing content, but training yourself to do exactly what we just did. So here are a couple of tips. Tip number 1, train with sources. Take any source, artifact, quote, image, run with it. The same 3 steps you just practiced. What is happening? How is freedom being practiced? What larger system does this connect to? And notice what that does. It forces you to move from observation to explanation to analysis. And if you can do that consistently, you're preparing exactly for what the exam will ask you to do. Tip number 2 is to organize by domains. The second move comes directly from how we structure the FRQ. Instead of memorizing everything in order, organize what you know in domains: law, culture, movement, identity. This gives you a mental framework, so even if you don't remember every detail, you still have a way to build an answer just like you did in the FRQ examples. And step number 3, practice precision. Practice saying more with less. Challenge yourself to explain any concept into 2 to 3 sentences, not long paragraphs. That's not what the exam readers are looking for. Not everything, just a clear, direct explanation, because that's what the exam rewards: your ability to take knowledge and turn it into explanation. So what you should see here is this: the way you practice, study, the way you answer questions are all all the same skill. And once you're locked in, you're not just preparing for this unit, you're preparing to succeed on the entire exam. You've already done the work. You've seen what freedom looks like in Reconstruction and laws written and reimagined. You've seen it in the face of constraint in Jim Crow and the Red Summer and communities forced to defend themselves. And you've seen it take shape in new ways in classrooms, churches, businesses, and the poetry and art of people like Dunbar and Du Bois and the creativity of Harlem. This review is about sharpening how you understand all of that. So trust your preparation, and when you see those sources, pause just long enough to recognize that what you're looking at, what you can do, is what historians do: interpret, explain, and connect. Because in that moment, you're not just recalling Reconstruction or migration or the Harlem Renaissance, you're demonstrating how freedom is practiced, and that's what earns the score. This is Dr. Kamasi Hill. This is a Grio's History Unit 3 review. And always remember to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the story alive.